Hello, IB Biology students. This is Miss Sheely with your next installment of your video lecture notes. Please remember to not only take notes as you listen and I go through the material, but please also remember to jot down any questions you have so that when we are reviewing the material in class, you can remember to ask those. So this is on natural selection, so we're going to continue with our evolution discussion. So who was the first person to realize that species evolved by natural selection? So this actually is really kind of an interesting situation. We typically give credit to Darwin because he developed and published the theory. He was the first to publish a detailed account of it. But Darwin had actually delayed publishing because he feared a hostile reaction. And it wasn't until another biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, wrote him a letter in 1858 and suggested that he, with his ideas and wanted Darwin's opinions, and Darwin saw that these opinions and these theories were very similar to his own, and he wanted to make sure that he got that credit, and he went ahead and published his book. So we have three main sources of variation that lead to changes in organisms or populations. All three of these sources of variation within an organism are going to occur before the organism has developed. So the first is mutation. So we have new alleles or sections of genes that are produced by gene mutation, and these changes in the mutation of the DNA can actually enlarge the gene pool of what's available in the population. The second is meiosis. So meiosis is how our sex cells are formed. So new combinations of alleles are made by breaking up existing combinations. So a normal cell has diploid number of chromosomes. So you have 2 of every chromosome. But when we go through meiosis, we reduce that number so that we only have half. And every cell that is produced by meiosis in just one individual, so in each individual, it can actually carry a different combination of alleles, and that is through a process called crossing over, which is represented here at the top of the slide, and independent assortment, or when our chromosomes or bivalents separate, and that's what you're seeing here in this lower picture. And then, of course, the last source of variation is just the sexual reproduction process itself. So that fusion of the male and the female gametes, the egg and the sperm, typically coming from different parents and fusing together, is going to give us variation within our population and within our organisms. All right, so we have different ways to explain natural selection. The first is overpopulation. So species tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support. So that is going to also lead to natural selection. If you have more organisms than the area can support, then not all of them will live. There will not be enough resources. So here's an exact example of overpopulation. Not all of these frog eggs will survive, and so what will determine whether they survive or not? Is it going to be due to the genes or some other factors as well? You also have a struggle for existence. So some individuals will die throughout their lives and some will survive. So here you have a predator-prey situation where the large elephant is trying to protect its young from the crocodile. The third is variation. So here we have a bunch of pictures of giraffes, all different patterns and colorations. So in natural populations, you actually have a lot of variation between individuals. Survival of the fittest. So this isn't super realistic, but some individuals are better adapted to their environments than others. And adaptation, of course, is a characteristic that makes an individual suited for its environment and its way of life. So individuals that are better suited have better adaptations, better suited, able to survive, and thus can make more offspring. And so the less well-adapted organisms will not survive and will probably not even be able to reproduce before they die. So that each generation will only contain more and more of the genes for the better adapted organisms. All right, so we have, again, an abundance of successful variations. So if you're surviving, then it's probably because of your genes. So this goes hand in hand with that survival of the fittest, but it's why they are surviving, because of those genes, those successful adaptations and variations. The sixth point here is inheritance of characteristics. So individuals that reproduce will pass those characteristics on to their offspring. So if they are good characteristics, then they will pass those good characteristics on. And then the last one, changes in gene frequency. So the frequency of the characteristics that make individuals better adapted is going to increase within the population, and the frequency of the other characteristics are going to decrease. So over time, the species and the populations will change and become better adapted to the area. And this is a really good example of, or the peppered moth is a really good example of that. Here you have green genes for green color and genes for brown color. And at first, you have way more of the population with having the genes for the green population. But then you have a decrease in that, and you start to see more of the brown genes. So we saw that with the peppered moth. All right, so heritability also really works with evolution. So acquired characteristics, these are things that cannot be inherited and therefore cannot increase in a species by natural selection. So for example, the muscles and bones of your dominant arm of a tennis player will increase in size as a result of being utilized intensively. So right-handed tennis players will develop larger muscles and bones in their right arm, than in the left. But those genes have not changed. There's no you don't have different genes for your left arm and your right arm for your muscles. They're the same genes in both arms. So since those genes haven't been altered, then the arm of any children from this tennis player will be the same size. They will not pass on that genetic variation. All right, and bird beaks and the finches is also a really good example of what we call adaptive radiation. So one of Darwin's most famous examples that he published was the evolution of the Galapagos finches. So he noticed that the finches on different islands were very closely related, that they clearly came from one common ancestor, probably on the mainland, but yet they were different species. And he actually deduced and hypothesized that they had come from a single population on the mainland, and they were probably blown or flown to their new habitats by a storm. And each habitat, because it had different selection pressures over millions of years, the finches developed adaptations to make them suit their island. So they became separate species. Let's take a moment to look at this. So, of course, the Galapagos Islands, located west of South American mainland. The islands were formed by volcanoes and are geologically much younger than the mainland. There's lots of life in Ecuador, such as the finch. And over time, the finch migrated to the different islands that were formed by the volcanoes. They populated the islands. And as they settled on the different islands, they discovered how different each island was. Finches adapted slowly to their new environment. like the kind of food that was available. By the time Darwin arrived in the Galapagos, 12 new species of finch could be found. Now, each individual finch did not change. Instead, it had mutations that allowed it to change, and those were the ones that survived. So the finches helped Charles Darwin realize that life adapts to its environment. So this is a large cactus finch, a medium ground finch, another cactus finch, but smaller, medium tree finch, vegetarian finch, a woodpecker finch, small tree finch, mangrove finch, small ground finch, large cactus finch, large tree finch, and a sharp-beaked finch. So they all have different beaks. All right, another way that we can look at evolution in action, so to speak, is to look at the antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So bacteria is really nice because we can observe, they have a very short life cycle, so we can observe evolution in a short period of time. So bacteria are going to reproduce, and when they reproduce, they're going to have different variations. This is a very simple schematic where you have just a simple round bacteria, and in their reproduction, they're going to have different variations, and with maybe proteins on their outside, their coat, and then those variations will reproduce, and there will be multiples. We then, of course, do not want to be sick, so we take antibiotics, and these antibiotics can interact with 2 out of the 3 variations, and so the antibiotics will kill 2 out of the 3 variations of the same bacteria. So we have one strand that's not killed, and so that becomes a resistant strain, and that's going to survive. And what's it going to do when it survives? It's going to make more of that same variation. So that resistant strain, not only does it not die, but it continues to reproduce and grow in numbers. And then the resistant bacteria, you take more antibiotics because you're still sick, but that antibiotics don't work. So the genes for the resistance are passed on, and the population continues to grow and grow. And so this population of bacteria is now resistant to the antibiotics we have used. You can see this in the application of the antibiotic methicillin. So in that same scenario that we looked at, methicillin susceptible Staph aureus is killed. So those are the ones that are affected by the methicillin. It's killed Staphylococcus aureus, they die. But we have methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and that is a type of bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus, that will survive. And that it's abbreviated MRSA, M-R-S-A, so methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So that's going to survive. And of course, if it survives, it's going to be able to reproduce. And then those genes for the resistance to methicillin will continue to proliferate amongst the population. And you can see here we have the resistant Staph aureus with more genes for the resistance, and the methicillin sensitive or susceptible Staphylococcus aureus is missing some of those genes. So the MRSA, or methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus population, is going to increase. It's going to become the dominant strain, and the problem is that this methicillin, which was our strongest antibiotic, is no longer effective against the infection. And this is a big problem in hospitals and patients around the world, but particularly in the U.S. All right, so that's actually it for today. We're going to continue to look at the bird beaks in class. So see you in class. Remember to bring your questions.